Welcome to the Sleepy Historian, where the gentle currents of time carry us through the quiet corridors of the past. Tonight, we embark on a peaceful journey through the misty landscapes of medieval England, from the Norman Conquest of 1066 to the dawn of the Tudor Age in the late 15th century. As we drift together through these centuries, let the soft rhythm of history's flow guide you toward rest. The ancient stones of Norman castles await us, along with the whispered prayers in candle-lit cathedrals and the quiet footsteps of kings and queens who shaped a realm that would endure for generations. Before we begin our journey, I invite you to share where you are listening from tonight. Perhaps you're tucked beneath warm blankets in a cozy room, or maybe you're watching the stars from somewhere far away. Leave a comment and let us know where in the world you're joining us. And if this gentle journey through time brings you peace, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to The Sleepy Historian for more restful adventures through history. Now, close your eyes if you wish, and let us travel back through the mists of time to an autumn day in 1066, when the fate of England would be decided on a field near the town of Hastings, forever changing the course of a kingdom. The morning mist clung to the Sussex coastline as two armies faced each other across a gentle hill near Hastings. It was October 14th, 1066, and the last Anglo-Saxon king of England, Harold Godwinson, stood with his tired warriors at the crest of Senlac Hill. Below them, the Norman forces of William, Duke of Normandy, prepared for what would become one of history's most consequential battles. Harold's men were weary. Just weeks before, they had marched north to defeat another invader, Harald Hardrada of Norway, at a Stamford Bridge. The victory had been complete, but it had cost them dearly in time and strength. Now, as the autumn sun climbed higher, they faced another challenge from across the narrow waters of the English Channel. William of Normandy had crossed those waters with a purpose that burned quietly in his heart. He believed, with the certainty that comes from deep conviction, that the English throne was rightfully his. Years earlier, he claimed, the childless King Edward the Confessor had promised him the succession. Moreover, Harold himself had sworn an oath to support William's claim, though the circumstances of that oath remained wrapped in the shadows of conflicting memories. The battle that followed would echo through the centuries, but in our peaceful telling, we need not dwell on its harsh details. Instead, let us imagine the quiet moments before the conflict began. Harold, tall and weathered by campaigns, perhaps gazed across the morning landscape and thought of his kingdom, his people, and the weight of the crown that had rested on his head for less than a year. William, meanwhile, may have whispered a prayer to the saints whose relics he carried into battle, seeking divine favor for his cause. As the day progressed, the tide slowly turned in William's favor. The Norman cavalry, with their distinctive conical helmets and long shields, gradually wore down the Saxon shield wall. Archers sent flights of arrows arcing through the autumn air, and gradually the disciplined ranks of Harold's houseguards began to falter. Near the end of the day, as shadows lengthened across the battlefield, King Harold fell. The manner of his death became the subject of many tales, but what matters for our story is that with his passing, the age of Anglo-Saxon England came to a quiet close. The crown of England would rest upon Norman brow, and a new chapter in the island's long story would begin. William, now to be known as William the Conqueror, did not immediately celebrate his victory with grand flourishes. Instead, he showed respect for the fallen king and began the methodical process of claiming his new realm. He ordered Harold to be buried with honor, though some accounts suggest the exact location of that burial became lost to time, adding an air of mystery to the end of the Saxon age. The weeks following Hastings saw William's careful advance toward London. Rather than rushing to claim his prize, he moved with the deliberation of a man who understood that conquest was only the beginning of kingship. Towns and settlements along his path submitted without resistance, their leaders perhaps sensing that opposition would be futile against this determined Norman duke. London itself proved more cautious. The city's leaders and the surviving members of the Anglo-Saxon nobility gathered to consider their options. For a brief time, they contemplated elevating Edgar Etheling, a young claimant with royal blood, to the throne. But as William's forces drew nearer and the reality of Norman victory became undeniable, their resolve gradually dissolved. On Christmas Day, 1066, in the ancient Westminster Abbey that Edward the Confessor had recently completed, William knelt before the altar to receive his crown. The ceremony blended Norman and English traditions, conducted by both Norman and English clergy. As the crown was placed upon his head, William became not just a conqueror, but a legitimate king in the eyes of both God and his new subjects. The abbey filled with the sound of voices raised in acclamation. But outside, some of William's Norman guards, mistaking the noise for signs of rebellion, began setting fires in the surrounding streets. The coronation continued amid this confusion, creating an atmosphere that seemed to foretell the challenges ahead. William would need to balance the preservation of English customs with the establishment of Norman authority, a delicate task that would define his reign. The new king faced a realm that was both familiar and foreign. Anglo-Saxon England had been a sophisticated kingdom with established laws, customs, and administrative systems. The Anglo-Saxons had built magnificent churches, created beautiful manuscripts, and developed a culture that blended Germanic traditions with Christian learning. William was wise enough to recognize that wholesale destruction of this heritage would benefit no one. Yet change was inevitable. The Norman Conquest represented more than a simple change of dynasty. William brought with him a continental perspective, ties to the broader European world, and a different approach to kingship and governance. Where Anglo-Saxon kings had ruled through consent and collaboration with powerful earls, William would establish a more centralized and hierarchical system of control. In the months following his coronation, William began distributing English lands to his Norman followers, rewarding their loyalty and service while ensuring their continued support. This redistribution was carried out with careful attention to both rewarding the deserving and maintaining stability. Norman nobles received substantial holdings, but they were scattered across the kingdom rather than concentrated in single regions, preventing any individual from becoming too powerful. The Anglo-Saxon nobility faced difficult choices. Some chose to resist the new order and found themselves dispossessed of their lands and titles. Others, recognizing the reality of Norman victory, sought accommodation with their new rulers. Many Anglo-Saxon thegns who submitted to William found that they could retain portions of their holdings and continue to play roles in local governance, though always under Norman oversight. The Church also experienced significant changes, though these evolved gradually rather than dramatically. William had papal support for his conquest, having convinced Pope Alexander II that his cause was just. Gradually, Norman clerics replaced Anglo-Saxon bishops and abbots, bringing with them reformed practices and closer ties to continental Christianity. Yet many English religious traditions persisted, and the magnificent Anglo-Saxon churches continued to serve their communities much as before. As 1066 drew to a close and the year 1067 began, William could look upon his new kingdom with cautious satisfaction. The immediate conquest was complete, but the true work of kingship lay ahead. He would need to establish systems of governance that could unite Norman and Anglo-Saxon traditions, defend his new realm against both internal rebellion and external threats, and create a legacy worthy of his remarkable achievement. The Norman dawn had broken over England, bringing with it the promise of centuries of change and development. In the quiet halls of newly built Norman castles and the ancient chambers of Anglo-Saxon palaces, the future of a kingdom was being shaped by the careful hands of a conqueror who had become a king. The story of medieval England had begun, and its first chapter would be written in stone and parchment, in law and custom, in the patient work of building a nation that would endure through the centuries to come. In the years following his coronation, William the Conqueror began the patient work of transformation that would forever alter the landscape of England. Across the realm, from the Scottish borders to the shores of the English Channel, the sound of stone being cut and timber being shaped echoed through valleys and over hills. This was the age of great building, when Norman ambition took physical form in the castles and cathedrals that would define medieval England. The most visible symbol of Norman authority became the castle, and none was more impressive than the Tower of London. Rising beside the Thames, its white stone walls reflected the changing moods of the river and sky. William chose this location carefully, positioning his fortress where it could command the approach to London while demonstrating the permanence of Norman rule to any who might question it. The tower was not built in haste. Stone by stone, skilled craftsmen shaped blocks of limestone brought from Normandy itself, each piece carefully fitted to create walls that would endure for centuries. The great keep, later known as the White Tower, rose nearly 100 feet into the London sky, its walls thick enough to withstand any siege while providing comfortable quarters for the king and his court. But the Tower of London was only the beginning. Across England, William's followers constructed castles that served both practical and symbolic purposes. At first, many were simple earthwork and timber constructions, known as motte and bailey castles. An artificial hill, the motte, supported a wooden tower, while a courtyard below, the bailey, housed the garrison and stables. These could be built quickly by local labour, establishing Norman presence, while more elaborate stone fortifications were planned. Rochester Castle in Kent began to take shape along these lines, its massive stone keep eventually rising to dominate the Medway Valley. Warwick Castle commanded the approaches to the Midlands, while Durham Castle, built on a rocky peninsula above the River Wear, would for centuries guard the turbulent northern frontier. Each castle was positioned with careful attention to geography and strategy, creating a network of fortifications that could control the kingdom's major routes and river crossings. The building of these castles represented more than military necessity. They were statements of permanence, declarations that the Norman Conquest was not a temporary occupation, but a fundamental transformation. The sight of these stone towers rising against the English sky must have impressed Anglo-Saxon observers with the determination and resources of their new rulers. Alongside the castles rose the great cathedrals, structures that spoke to the Norman commitment to Christian governance and cultural achievement. Canterbury Cathedral, the spiritual heart of English Christianity, was rebuilt on a grander scale under the direction of Lanfranc, the scholarly Norman monk who became William's Archbishop of Canterbury. The new cathedral's soaring arches and elaborate stonework demonstrated that Norman rule would bring not just military might, but also artistic and intellectual advancement. Durham Cathedral, begun in the 1090s, would become perhaps the finest example of Norman architectural achievement in England. Built on the rocky peninsula above the River Wear, alongside the castle, it created a magnificent complex that symbolized the unity of temporal and spiritual authority. Its massive pillars, some carved with intricate patterns, supported innovative ribbed vaulting that allowed for unprecedented height and grandeur. The cathedral's nave, stretching over 400 feet in length, created a space that inspired awe and reverence in all who entered. Winchester Cathedral was similarly transformed, its Anglo-Saxon predecessor replaced by a Norman structure of imposing scale and dignity. The new building, eventually stretching to nearly 600 feet in length, would become one of Europe's longest cathedrals, its quiet grandeur reflecting the wealth and ambition of Norman England. These building projects required unprecedented organization and resources. Stone had to be quarried, often from locations many miles away, then transported by cart and barge to the construction sites. Skilled craftsmen, including stone masons, carpenters, and metal workers, were brought from Normandy and other parts of France, establishing workshops that would train English apprentices in the new architectural styles. The impact on local communities was profound, but generally positive. Castle and cathedral building provided employment for thousands of workers over periods of decades. Entire industries developed to support the construction efforts, from quarrying and timber cutting to the production of lime for mortar and lead for roofing. Towns grew up around major construction sites, creating prosperity that would endure long after the buildings were completed. To support and organize this transformation, William commissioned what would become known as the Domesday Book, one of the most remarkable administrative achievements of medieval Europe. Completed in 1086, this great survey recorded the landholdings, resources, and obligations of virtually every settlement in England. Teams of royal commissioners travelled throughout the kingdom, gathering information with unprecedented thoroughness and precision. The Domesday Survey revealed England to be a land of considerable wealth and complexity. The commissioners recorded not just who owned what lands, but also the number of ploughs, the extent of forests and pastures, the presence of mills and churches, and the obligations owed to various lords. This information allowed William to understand exactly what resources his kingdom possessed and how they could be most effectively utilized. The creation of Domesday Book also represented a significant administrative innovation. Never before had any European kingdom been surveyed with such completeness and accuracy. The project required a sophisticated understanding of record-keeping, legal procedures, and territorial organization. The fact that it was completed successfully within a single year demonstrates the effectiveness of Norman administrative capabilities. For the people of England, the Domesday Survey represented both continuity and change. Many Anglo-Saxon settlements retained their traditional names and boundaries, while their new Norman lords were recorded alongside their previous Anglo-Saxon owners. The survey thus captured a moment of transition, when Old and New England existed side by side in the same administrative framework. The years following the completion of Domesday Book saw the consolidation of Norman administrative systems throughout England. The kingdom was divided into shires, each under the authority of a sheriff who answered directly to the king. These sheriffs were responsible for collecting taxes, administering royal justice, and maintaining order within their territories. Most were Norman nobles who combined military capability with administrative skill. The legal system also underwent gradual transformation. While William initially promised to preserve Anglo-Saxon laws and customs, Norman legal concepts gradually became integrated into English practice. The result was a hybrid system that preserved much of Anglo-Saxon legal tradition while incorporating Norman innovations in areas such as land tenure and feudal obligations. Churches and monasteries played crucial roles in this administrative transformation. Many possessed extensive lands and considerable wealth, making them important partners in royal governance. Norman abbots and bishops brought with them reformed religious practices and closer ties to continental Christianity, while also serving as royal advisors and administrators. The scriptorium of English monasteries began producing manuscripts that reflected the cultural synthesis taking place throughout the kingdom. Anglo-Saxon scribal traditions continued, but they were now applied to copying Norman legal texts, classical works favored by Norman scholars, and religious writings that reflected the reformed Christianity of the continental church. As the 11th century drew toward its close, the transformation of England was well advanced, but not yet complete. Norman castles dominated the landscape, and Norman cathedrals offered spaces for worship that surpassed anything previously seen in England. The Domesday Book provided the Crown with unprecedented knowledge of the kingdom's resources and capabilities. Yet beneath these visible changes, much of Anglo-Saxon England endured, adapted, and gradually merged with Norman innovations to create something entirely new. The reign of William the Conqueror was drawing toward its end, and the question of succession began to occupy the minds of nobles and clergy. William's eldest son, Robert Curthose, held the Duchy of Normandy, while his younger sons, William Rufus and Henry, waited to learn what inheritance their father would leave them. The unity of the Norman realm, so carefully constructed, would soon face its first great test. In the quiet scriptorium of monasteries and the councils of nobles, men began to speak cautiously of what would come next. The foundations had been laid in stone and parchment, in law and custom. The Norman transformation of England was largely complete, but the question remained: would the next generation of rulers be able to maintain and build upon what William the Conqueror had achieved? The death of William the Conqueror in 1087 marked the beginning of a new and more complex chapter in the story of medieval England. As the great king lay dying in Rouen, the question of succession cast long shadows across both sides of the English Channel. His decision to divide his lands between his sons would create decades of tension and conflict, though in our peaceful telling we shall focus on the human stories and quiet moments that shaped this turbulent era. William Rufus, so called for his ruddy complexion and red hair, became King William II of England, while his elder brother Robert Curthose inherited the Duchy of Normandy. The youngest brother, Henry, received a substantial sum of money, but no lands, leaving him to carve out his own destiny through wit and opportunity. This division satisfied no one completely, and pleased Robert Curthose least of all, as he had expected to inherit the entirety of his father's dominions. William II's reign began amid the shadows of uncertainty. Many Norman barons held lands on both sides of the Channel and found themselves torn between conflicting loyalties. Some preferred Robert's claim to England, viewing him as the rightful heir as the eldest son. Others, particularly those who had prospered under William I, chose to support the new king who actually held power in England. The first years of William II's reign saw several rebellions, but these were resolved more through negotiation and compromise than through prolonged warfare. The king demonstrated both his father's determination and a political flexibility that allowed him to win over former opponents. He was generous to those who submitted to his authority and careful to reward loyalty with grants of land and position. William II possessed many admirable qualities as a ruler. He was personally brave, leading his armies from the front when military action became necessary. He showed genuine concern for the administration of justice, often hearing legal cases personally and ensuring that his subjects could appeal directly to royal authority when local officials failed them. His court became a center of learning and culture, attracting scholars, poets, and artists from across Western Europe. The king's relationship with the church proved more complicated. William II believed strongly in royal authority over ecclesiastical matters, a position that brought him into conflict with some bishops and abbots who preferred greater independence from secular control. These disputes, while sometimes heated, were generally resolved through compromise and discussion rather than outright confrontation. One of the most significant challenges of William II's reign came from beyond England's borders. The Welsh princes, taking advantage of what they perceived as instability in the Norman kingdom, launched raids into the border regions. William responded with a series of campaigns that gradually extended Norman influence into Wales, though he was wise enough to work with Welsh rulers who were willing to acknowledge his overlordship rather than attempting complete conquest. Scotland also required the king's attention. King Malcolm III of Scotland had married Margaret, sister of Edgar Atheling, the Anglo-Saxon prince who might have claimed the English throne after Harold's death at Hastings. Malcolm's raids into northern England forced William to respond, but here too, diplomacy ultimately proved more effective than warfare. A meeting between the two kings at Abernethy resulted in a peaceful settlement that acknowledged William's superiority while allowing Malcolm to retain his kingdom. The question of succession remained a constant concern throughout William II's reign. The king never married, though he maintained close friendships with several courtiers and showed particular favor to talented individuals regardless of their backgrounds. His court became known for its cosmopolitan atmosphere, where merit mattered more than birth and where scholarship flourished alongside military prowess. In August 1100, while hunting in the New Forest, King William II met his death in circumstances that would become the subject of lasting speculation. An arrow, shot by one of his companions, struck and killed him instantly. Whether this was accident or design remained unknown, but what mattered for the kingdom was that Henry, the youngest of William I's sons, was present and acted swiftly to claim the crown. Henry's seizure of the English throne demonstrated both political acumen and decisive action. Rather than waiting for his brother Robert, who was returning from the First Crusade, Henry rode immediately to Winchester, secured the royal treasury, and then proceeded to London for his coronation. Within 3 days of his brother's death, he had been crowned King Henry I of England. The new king understood that he needed to secure the loyalty of his subjects quickly and decisively. His first act was to issue the Charter of Liberties, a document that promised to remedy various grievances and govern according to just principles. This charter recalled the good laws of Edward the Confessor, while promising to eliminate various abuses that had developed during his brother's reign. Henry I also demonstrated political wisdom by marrying Matilda, daughter of Malcolm III of Scotland, and his Anglo-Saxon wife Margaret. This union created important political alliances while also symbolically linking Norman rule to the Anglo-Saxon past. Matilda was descended from the Old English royal house, and her marriage to Henry helped reconcile Anglo-Saxon nobility to Norman rule. The early years of Henry I's reign were marked by the constant threat of invasion from Normandy, where Robert Curthose contested his brother's right to the English crown. This threat culminated in 1106 at the Battle of Tinchebray, where Henry defeated and captured Robert, thus reuniting his father's dominions under single rule. Robert spent the remaining 28 years of his life as his brother's prisoner, treated with courtesy, but never allowed his freedom. With the Norman succession settled, Henry I could focus on the arts of peace. His reign became synonymous with effective administration and legal development. The king established a sophisticated system of royal finance, with the exchequer developing procedures for accounting and revenue collection that would endure for centuries. Royal justices travelled throughout the kingdom, ensuring that the king's law reached even the most remote areas. The court of Henry I attracted scholars and writers from across Europe. The king himself was literate, a relatively unusual accomplishment for a ruler of his era, and he encouraged learning and intellectual discourse. Chroniclers began writing more sophisticated histories of England, while poets and storytellers found patronage and encouragement. One of the most remarkable aspects of Henry I's reign was his relationship with his daughter Matilda, later known as the Empress Matilda after her marriage to Henry V, Holy Roman Emperor. When the emperor died in 1125, Matilda returned to England, and her father began preparing her to succeed him on the throne. This was an unprecedented step in an age when female rule was virtually unknown, but Henry had no surviving legitimate sons, and believed that Matilda possessed the intelligence and strength necessary for kingship. The king required his barons to swear oaths recognizing Matilda as his heir, a ceremony that took place with great solemnity in the royal court. Many nobles harbored private doubts about female rule, but none dared oppose the king's will openly. Henry arranged Matilda's second marriage to Geoffrey of Anjou, a union that would eventually bring the rich lands of Anjou into the English royal patrimony. Throughout his long reign, Henry I demonstrated remarkable consistency in his approach to governance. He was firm in maintaining royal authority, but careful to work within established legal frameworks. He could be ruthless when crossed, but preferred to win loyalty through fair dealing and generous reward. His court was orderly without being oppressive, learned without being pretentious. The king's relationship with the church evolved gradually from early tensions to mutual cooperation. Henry initially clashed with Archbishop Anselm over questions of royal authority in ecclesiastical matters, but both men were reasonable and devout, and they eventually found compromises that satisfied both royal and papal concerns. Anselm became one of Henry's most trusted advisers, demonstrating that secular and spiritual authority could work in harmony. As Henry I aged, the question of succession grew ever more pressing. The tragedy of the White Ship in 1120, when the king's only legitimate son, William, drowned in the English Channel, had forced Henry to look beyond traditional male inheritance. His decision to name Matilda as his heir represented both personal necessity and political innovation. The final years of Henry's reign were peaceful and prosperous. England enjoyed internal stability, while the king's continental possessions remained secure. Trade flourished, monasteries expanded their lands and influence, and the population appears to have grown steadily. The foundations laid by William the Conqueror had been built upon and strengthened, creating a kingdom that was both stable and prosperous. When Henry I died in December 1135, he left behind a complex legacy. His administrative innovations had strengthened royal government immeasurably, while his legal reforms had created more consistent and effective systems of justice. His decision to name a female heir, however brave and forward-thinking, would soon plunge England into civil war. The peaceful transfer of power that had characterized the Norman period would give way to the contested succession known as the Anarchy, a time when the very survival of unified royal authority would hang in the balance. The crown that rested uneasily upon Stephen's head after Henry I's death would eventually pass to a line of kings whose domains stretched from the Scottish borders to the Pyrenees. This was the Angevin Empire, and its most legendary ruler would be Richard I, known to history as the Lionheart. Yet before Richard could claim his inheritance, England would endure decades of civil war and gradual recovery under his father, Henry II, whose reign laid the foundations for a golden age of medieval kingship. The anarchy that followed Henry I's death had seen cousin fight cousin as Stephen of Blois contested the crown with Matilda, Henry's chosen heir. For nearly 20 years, England experienced the bitter consequences of disputed succession, with castles changing hands, rival courts competing for loyalty, and the machinery of royal government grinding slowly toward collapse. The resolution came not through decisive battle, but through patient negotiation, as Stephen eventually agreed to recognize Matilda's son, Henry, as his heir. Henry II ascended the English throne in 1154 as a young man of 21, but he already possessed extensive continental territories through his inheritance from his father, Geoffrey of Anjou, and his marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine. This remarkable woman, previously Queen of France before her marriage was annulled, brought with her the vast Duchy of Aquitaine, making Henry the most powerful ruler in Western Europe. The new king faced the enormous task of restoring royal authority after the chaos of Stephen's reign. Unauthorized castles had to be destroyed or brought under royal control. The machinery of government had to be rebuilt, and the kingdom's finances had to be restored to health. Henry approached these challenges with characteristic energy and systematic determination. The restoration of England proved remarkably successful. Henry's administrative innovations, building upon his grandfather, Henry I's foundations, created systems of government that would endure for centuries. The development of common law, administered by royal judges traveling on regular circuits, brought consistent justice to every corner of the kingdom. The Exchequer refined its accounting procedures, ensuring that royal revenues were collected and recorded with unprecedented accuracy. Yet Henry II is perhaps best remembered not for his administrative achievements, but for his tragic conflict with Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who had once been his closest friend and adviser. Becket, appointed to the archbishopric in 1162, underwent what can only be described as a spiritual transformation, abandoning the comfortable life of a royal chancellor to embrace the austere discipline of religious devotion. The conflict between king and archbishop grew from genuine disagreements about the proper relationship between secular and spiritual authority. Henry believed that royal courts should judge clergy accused of crimes, while Becket insisted that only church courts could try ecclesiastical cases. This dispute, which might have been resolved through compromise and goodwill, instead escalated into a bitter personal conflict that divided loyalties throughout England. The tragedy reached its climax on December 29th, 1170, when 4 knights, believing they were acting on the king's wishes, murdered Becket before the altar of Canterbury Cathedral. The news of this sacrilege horrified Christian Europe and transformed Becket overnight from a controversial archbishop into a martyred saint. Henry, genuinely grief-stricken at the death of his former friend, was forced to do public penance and accept significant limitations on royal authority over the church. The Becket affair cast a shadow over Henry's reign, but it did not prevent him from achieving remarkable success in other areas. His legal reforms created the foundations of English common law, while his administrative innovations established royal government on a scale and effectiveness unknown elsewhere in Europe. His continental territories were generally well governed, and he maintained largely peaceful relations with the French crown and other neighboring powers. The king's marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, while politically advantageous, proved personally turbulent. Eleanor was a remarkable woman in her own right, patron of troubadours and poets, leader of the Second Crusade during her first marriage, and mother of 10 children. However, her relationship with Henry deteriorated over the years, leading to her supporting their sons in rebellion against their father in 1173–74. This great rebellion revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of Henry's empire. While his sons, supported by Eleanor, the King of France, and various continental nobles, could mount a serious challenge to his authority, Henry's resources and administrative capabilities ultimately proved decisive. The rebellion collapsed, and Henry demonstrated characteristic magnanimity in victory, pardoning his sons and welcoming them back into his favor. The question of succession remained complex throughout Henry's reign. His eldest son, Henry, crowned in his father's lifetime to secure the succession, died prematurely in 1183. This left Richard, already established as Duke of Aquitaine, as the heir apparent. Richard had proven himself an effective military commander in his mother's duchy, where he had spent most of his adult life suppressing rebellions and defending the territory against various threats. When Henry II died in July 1189, Richard inherited an empire at the height of its power and prosperity. England was peaceful and well governed, while the continental territories were secure and wealthy. The new king, however, had priorities that lay far from the grey skies and misty landscapes of his island kingdom. His heart was set upon the Holy Land, where Saladin had recently recaptured Jerusalem, inspiring the Third Crusade. Richard I's coronation took place amid great splendour at Westminster Abbey in September 1189. The ceremony emphasized both the sacred nature of kingship and the international character of the Angevin Empire. Representatives from throughout Western Europe attended, acknowledging Richard's status as one of Christendom's premier rulers. Yet even as he received his crown, the new king was already planning his departure for the Holy Land. The preparations for the Third Crusade consumed much of Richard's attention during the early months of his reign. England's resources were systematically organized to support this great enterprise, with taxes raised, supplies gathered, and ships prepared for the journey to the east. Richard sold offices, privileges, and even castles to raise funds, famously declaring that he would sell London itself if he could find a buyer. Richard's departure for the Holy Land in 1190 began one of the most legendary chapters in medieval history. The king's crusading exploits, his victories at Acre and Arsuf, his negotiations with Saladin, and his ultimate failure to recapture Jerusalem became the subjects of countless songs and stories. Yet for England, Richard's absence created both challenges and opportunities. The government of England during Richard's crusade demonstrated the effectiveness of the administrative systems developed by Henry II. Royal officials, led by the justiciar Hubert Walter, maintained order and collected revenues with remarkable efficiency. The kingdom experienced few serious internal disturbances, despite the king's prolonged absence and the heavy financial demands of the crusade. The most serious threat to Richard's authority came not from England, but from his brother John, who attempted to seize power while Richard was imprisoned in Germany on his return journey from the Holy Land. John's rebellion found little support among the English nobility, who remained loyal to their absent king. The swift collection of Richard's enormous ransom, requiring unprecedented financial exertion, demonstrated both the kingdom's prosperity and the loyalty of its subjects. Richard's return to England in March 1194 was brief but triumphant. The king spent only 2 months in his kingdom before departing again for his continental territories, where warfare with Philip Augustus of France required his personal attention. These would be the last months that Richard ever spent in England, though he remained deeply concerned with its governance and prosperity. The final years of Richard's reign were dominated by his struggle with Philip Augustus for control of Normandy and the other continental territories. This conflict, while expensive and demanding, showcased Richard's abilities as a military commander and castle builder. His construction of Château Gaillard in Normandy represented the pinnacle of medieval military architecture and demonstrated his determination to defend his inheritance. Richard's death in April 1199, while besieging the castle of Chalus in the Limousin, marked the end of an extraordinary reign. The arrow wound that proved fatal came during what should have been a minor operation, but it deprived England of a king who, despite his long absences, had maintained the kingdom's prosperity and international prestige. The legend of Richard the Lionheart grew in the centuries following his death, transforming him into the ideal of Christian kingship and chivalric virtue. His crusading exploits inspired countless tales of adventure and romance, while his conflicts with Saladin became the stuff of legend throughout both Christian and Islamic worlds. For England, Richard's reign represented both the heights of Angevin power and the beginning of its decline. The kingdom had proven its wealth and administrative sophistication by supporting a series of expensive foreign campaigns while maintaining internal peace and prosperity. Yet the financial strains of crusading and continental warfare had begun to test the limits of even England's resources. The crown would now pass to John, the youngest of Henry II's sons, a man whose reign would see both the loss of most continental territories and the signing of Magna Carta. The age of the great Angevin Empire was drawing toward its close, but its achievements in government, law, and culture would endure long after its political unity had dissolved. As Richard's body was laid to rest at Fontevraud Abbey beside his father, Henry II, the troubadours of Eleanor's court perhaps reflected on the passing of an age when English kings ruled from Scotland to the Pyrenees, and when the island kingdom stood at the center of a vast medieval empire that stretched across the face of Western Europe. The crown that descended to John Lackland in April 1199 carried with it the accumulated glories and burdens of the Angevin Empire. Yet this youngest son of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine would find that inheritance far more difficult to maintain than his illustrious predecessors had been to win. John's reign would witness the loss of most continental territories, bitter conflicts with his own barons, and ultimately the creation of a document that would forever change the relationship between English kings and their subjects. John had spent much of his early career in the shadow of his older brothers. Where Henry, the young king, had been groomed for succession, and Richard had proven himself as a warrior and administrator in Aquitaine, John had been left to make his own opportunities. His father's nickname of Lackland reflected this reality, though Henry II had eventually provided John with the lordship of Ireland, where the young prince gained his first experience of independent rule. The transition from Richard to John proceeded smoothly enough, despite some initial uncertainty about the succession. John's nephew, Arthur of Brittany, son of the late Geoffrey, had an arguably stronger claim by modern principles of inheritance, but the English and Norman nobility preferred John's maturity and experience. The coronation took place at Westminster Abbey on May 27, 1199, with all the traditional ceremonies that marked the beginning of a new reign. John's early years as king showed promise. He possessed considerable intelligence and administrative ability, taking personal interest in the machinery of government in ways that his absent brother Richard never had. The king frequently heard legal cases himself, travelling extensively throughout England to dispense justice and ensure that royal authority reached every corner of his realm. The new king's attention to detail extended to all aspects of royal administration. He personally reviewed financial accounts, examined the efficiency of local officials, and maintained extensive correspondence with administrators throughout his territories. John's surviving letters reveal a ruler deeply engaged with the practical business of kingship, someone who understood that effective government required constant vigilance and personal involvement. Yet John also inherited enormous challenges from his predecessors. The Angevin Empire, for all its glory, had always been difficult to govern effectively. The continental territories required constant military and financial attention, while their defense placed enormous strains on English resources. Philip Augustus of France, moreover, had proven himself a shrewd and determined opponent during Richard's reign, and he was not inclined to allow John peaceful possession of his inheritance. The conflict with Philip Augustus began almost immediately after John's accession. The French king supported the claims of Arthur of Brittany, providing him with military assistance and diplomatic recognition. This created a complex web of alliances and enmities that would dominate European politics for years to come. John found himself fighting simultaneously to maintain his position in Normandy, Anjou, and his other continental holdings. The loss of these territories unfolded gradually, rather than through any single decisive defeat. John's resources, while considerable, were stretched thin across multiple fronts. Local nobles in the contested regions often chose to submit to Philip Augustus rather than endure prolonged warfare, while John's financial demands to support his military campaigns created resentment among both continental and English subjects. The fall of Château Gaillard in 1204, Richard's great fortress guarding the approach to Rouen, symbolized the crumbling of Angevin power in Normandy. This magnificent castle, considered impregnable when Richard built it, fell after a lengthy siege that demonstrated both Philip Augustus's persistence and John's inability to mount an effective relief effort. With Normandy lost, the other continental territories soon followed, leaving John with little more than his island kingdom and a few scattered possessions across the Channel. The loss of the continental empire had profound consequences for England. The kingdom was no longer merely one part of a vast international domain, but had become the sole focus of royal attention. This concentration of effort would eventually prove beneficial, but the immediate effects included increased financial demands as John sought resources to reconquer his lost territories. John's relationship with the Church also became increasingly strained during these years. The death of Archbishop Hubert Walter in 1205 led to a disputed election for the See of Canterbury, with John supporting one candidate, while the monks of Canterbury elected another. Pope Innocent III, one of the most assertive medieval popes, refused to accept either candidate and instead appointed Stephen Langton, an English scholar teaching in Paris. John's refusal to accept Langton led to an escalating conflict with the papacy. In 1208, Pope Innocent placed England under interdict, suspending most religious services throughout the kingdom. Churches fell silent, bells ceased to ring, and the normal rhythms of Christian life were disrupted. The interdict was followed in 1209 by John's personal excommunication, cutting him off from the Christian community and theoretically releasing his subjects from their oaths of loyalty. The king's response to these spiritual sanctions demonstrated both his resilience and his political isolation. Rather than submitting immediately, John used the crisis to strengthen royal finances by seizing church revenues and properties. His administration proved capable of maintaining order even without ecclesiastical support, though the psychological impact of the interdict undoubtedly weakened his position with many subjects. The resolution of the ecclesiastical crisis came only in 1213, when John finally submitted to papal authority and accepted Stephen Langton as Archbishop of Canterbury. This submission was more than symbolic, as John agreed to hold England as a papal fief, acknowledging the Pope as his feudal overlord. While this arrangement provided John with papal protection against his enemies, it also demonstrated the extent to which his political position had deteriorated. Archbishop Langton proved to be a figure of considerable importance in subsequent events. A learned and principled man, he quickly became a leader among those who opposed John's arbitrary rule and excessive financial demands. Langton possessed both the moral authority of his office and the intellectual sophistication necessary to articulate legal and constitutional principles that could justify resistance to royal tyranny. The final crisis of John's reign emerged from his renewed attempts to reconquer his lost continental territories. The king's military preparations for a campaign in France required unprecedented financial exertion, with taxes, fines, and feudal obligations pressed to their absolute limits. Many barons, already resentful of John's authoritarian tendencies and suspicious of his military competence, refused to support what they viewed as a hopeless enterprise. John's defeat at the Battle of Bouvines in 1214, where his allies were crushed by Philip Augustus and the Holy Roman Emperor, was captured, marked the end of any realistic hope for reconquering the Angevin Empire. The king returned to England facing not only military failure, but also open rebellion from a significant portion of his nobility. The baronial opposition that crystallized during 1214 and early 1215 was not simply a feudal revolt, but a constitutional movement guided by legal principles and historical precedents. Archbishop Langton played a crucial role in organizing this opposition, helping to articulate the legal basis for resistance to royal tyranny. The barons demanded not merely the redress of specific grievances, but the establishment of permanent limitations on royal authority. The negotiations that led to Magna Carta took place against a backdrop of escalating tension and the threat of civil war. John, facing military defeat and political isolation, had little choice but to negotiate with his opponents. The barons, for their part, sought not to overthrow the monarchy, but to establish it on a firmer legal foundation that would protect their rights and interests. The famous meeting at Runnymede in June 1215 produced the Great Charter, a document that would echo through the centuries as a foundation of constitutional government. In our peaceful telling, we might imagine the scene as one of reluctant reconciliation, with both king and barons recognizing the need for compromise even as they maintained their fundamental disagreements. Magna Carta contained provisions addressing specific grievances about taxation, judicial procedure, and feudal obligations, but its broader significance lay in its assertion that even kings were subject to law. The Charter established principles of due process, limited royal authority over taxation, and created mechanisms for ensuring royal compliance with its provisions. While much of its content dealt with the immediate concerns of the baronial class, its underlying principles would eventually extend to all subjects of the crown. John's acceptance of Magna Carta was reluctant and temporary. Within months of its signing, the king had obtained papal condemnation of the charter and was preparing to resume hostilities against his baronial opponents. The final year of his reign was spent in civil war, as John sought to restore his authority through military force, while his opponents invited French intervention to support their cause. The king's death in October 1216, struck down by illness while campaigning in the midst of civil war, brought this tragic reign to a close. John was buried at Worcester Cathedral, having expressed particular devotion to the saint whose shrine was housed there. His death removed the personal animosities that had made compromise impossible while leaving England facing foreign invasion and internal division. John's reign had witnessed both the nadir and a strange kind of triumph of Angevin kingship. The loss of the continental empire had been a military and political disaster, while the conflict over Magna Carta had revealed deep constitutional problems within the English kingdom. Yet the administrative systems developed by Henry II had proven resilient enough to survive both military defeat and civil war, while the creation of Magna Carta had established principles that would guide English constitutional development for centuries to come. The crown would now pass to John's 9-year-old son, Henry, beginning a regency that would need to heal the wounds of civil war while preserving the essential achievements of Angevin government. The Great Charter signed at Runnymede would be reissued and gradually integrated into English law, transforming from an instrument of baronial opposition into a cornerstone of constitutional monarchy. The king who had yielded so much had, perhaps inadvertently, contributed to the creation of a more durable and just system of government than any of his more successful predecessors had achieved. The minority of Henry III began amid the chaos of civil war and foreign invasion. Yet it would ultimately lead to the restoration of royal authority and the creation of new traditions of governance that would endure for generations. When the 9-year-old king was crowned at Gloucester in October 1216, using his mother's golden circlet in place of the crown jewels lost in the wash, few could have predicted that his reign would span more than half a century and witness the transformation of England from a war-torn kingdom into a stable and prosperous realm. The Regency government, led by the elderly William Marshal, Earl of Pembroke, proved remarkably effective in resolving the crisis inherited from John's reign. Marshal, renowned as the greatest knight of his age, brought to the Regency a combination of military prowess, political wisdom, and unquestioned loyalty to the Plantagenet dynasty. His first crucial decision was to reissue Magna Carta, demonstrating the new government's commitment to ruling within legal constraints. The reissue of Magna Carta in November 1216 was more than a political gesture. It was a foundational act that established the principle of limited monarchy as central to English governance. The Charter was modified to remove some provisions that had been directed specifically against John's person, but its essential principles remained intact. This reissue helped to win over many barons who had supported the rebellion, gradually isolating those who continued to resist royal authority. The defeat of the French invasion force at the Battle of Lincoln in 1217 marked the decisive turning point in the Civil War. Marshal's victory, achieved through a combination of strategic planning and personal courage, ended the realistic possibility of foreign conquest and restored the Plantagenet dynasty's control over England. The subsequent naval victory at the Battle of Sandwich completed the expulsion of foreign forces and secured England's independence. As Henry III grew to maturity during the 1220s and 1230s, he revealed himself to be a king of remarkable cultural sophistication and artistic sensibility. His greatest achievement would be the rebuilding of Westminster Abbey, a project that consumed decades of effort and enormous financial resources, but created one of the finest examples of Gothic architecture in Northern Europe. The new abbey, with its soaring arches and elaborate stonework, became a fitting symbol of Henry's artistic vision and his devotion to Edward the Confessor, whom he particularly venerated. Henry's personal rule, which began in earnest in the 1230s, was characterized by a genuine commitment to justice and good governance. The king took personal interest in judicial proceedings, often presiding over court sessions and ensuring that even humble subjects could obtain royal justice. His development of common law continued the work begun by Henry II, creating legal procedures and precedents that would form the foundation of English jurisprudence for centuries to come. Yet Henry III's reign also witnessed growing tensions over royal authority and baronial privileges. The king's preference for foreign advisers, particularly his wife's relatives from Provence and his own half-brothers from Poitou, created resentment among English nobles who felt excluded from influence and preferment. These tensions were exacerbated by Henry's expensive foreign policy, including unsuccessful attempts to recover lost territories in France and costly involvement in papal politics in Italy. The baronial opposition that emerged in the 1250s was led by Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester, Henry's brother-in-law and former close friend. De Montfort possessed both the military capability and the political vision necessary to challenge royal authority effectively. His criticism focused not on Henry's personal character, which was generally admirable, but on his methods of government and his failure to consult adequately with his natural counsellors, the great barons of the realm. The crisis came to a head at the Oxford Parliament of 1258, where Henry was forced to accept the provisions of Oxford, a comprehensive programme of governmental reform that placed significant limitations on royal authority. These provisions established a council of barons with extensive powers over royal government, required parliamentary approval for major policy decisions, and created mechanisms for ensuring royal compliance with baronial demands. The period from 1258 to 1265, known as the Baronial War, saw England torn by civil conflict as Henry sought to restore his authority, while de Montfort and his allies attempted to implement their constitutional reforms. The conflict was marked more by political maneuvering than by extensive military campaigns, as both sides recognized the dangers of prolonged warfare to the kingdom's stability and prosperity. The decisive battle at Evesham in August 1265 ended both the Baronial War and Simon de Montfort's life, but it didn't simply restore the pre-1258 status quo. Henry III, showing the wisdom that had marked his response to earlier crises, incorporated many of the barons' constitutional concerns into his restored government. The principle that major policy decisions required consultation with representative assemblies was gradually accepted, laying the foundation for the development of Parliament as a permanent institution. The final decades of Henry III's reign saw England enjoying unprecedented peace and prosperity. The king's artistic patronage flourished, creating not only Westminster Abbey, but also encouraging developments in manuscript illumination, metalwork, and other decorative arts. English scholars and artists gained international recognition, while the kingdom's universities at Oxford and Cambridge began to attract students from across Europe. Henry's son, Edward, who would later become Edward I, emerged during this period as an effective military commander and administrator. His leadership of a crusade to the Holy Land in the early 1270s demonstrated his capabilities, while allowing him to gain international experience and recognition. When Henry III died in November 1272, the succession proceeded smoothly, with Edward's accession recognized without opposition despite his absence in the Holy Land. Edward I, who became known as Longshanks for his imposing height, would prove to be one of medieval England's most effective rulers. His reign, beginning officially with his coronation in August 1274, would witness the conquest of Wales, sustained attempts to subdue Scotland, significant legal reforms, and the development of Parliament as a central institution of English governance. The conquest of Wales, completed by 1284, represented the culmination of centuries of Anglo-Norman expansion westward. Edward's campaigns were marked by careful planning, systematic castle building, and a determination to achieve complete conquest rather than mere overlordship. The construction of great castles at Conwy, Caernarfon, Harlech, and other strategic locations created a network of fortifications that secured English control over Wales for centuries to come. Edward's legal reforms, codified in statutes such as the Statute of Westminster and the Statute of Mortmain, systematized and clarified English law in ways that enhanced both royal authority and subjects' rights. These reforms demonstrated Edward's commitment to ruling through law rather than arbitrary will, continuing the constitutional tradition established by Magna Carta while strengthening the practical effectiveness of royal government. The king's relationship with Parliament evolved throughout his reign, as he discovered that representative assemblies could be valuable instruments for securing support for royal policies and raising the resources necessary for ambitious military campaigns. The model Parliament of 1295, which included representatives from shires, boroughs, and the clergy alongside the traditional baronial attendants, established patterns of parliamentary composition that would endure for centuries. Edward's Scottish campaigns, beginning in the 1290s, would dominate the later years of his reign and create lasting antagonisms between the two kingdoms. The extinction of the direct royal line in Scotland in 1290 led Edward to assert his overlordship and attempt to incorporate Scotland into his expanding realm. While initially successful, these campaigns ultimately failed to achieve lasting conquest and created the conditions for centuries of Anglo-Scottish warfare. The resistance led by William Wallace and later by Robert Bruce demonstrated that Scottish national identity had developed beyond the stage where conquest could be easily achieved or maintained. Edward's military successes, including victories at Falkirk and Stirling, proved temporary, while his harsh treatment of captured Scottish leaders created martyrs whose memory would inspire continued resistance. Edward's death in July 1307, while campaigning against the Scots, marked the end of one of England's most consequential reigns. His achievements in Wales, his legal reforms, his development of parliamentary government, and his strengthening of royal administration had transformed England into the most effectively governed kingdom in Europe. Yet his Scottish campaigns had also created problems that would plague his successors for generations to come. The crown passed to Edward II, a king whose character and capabilities would prove far different from his formidable father. The challenges of governing England and maintaining the Plantagenet inheritance would test this new king in ways that would ultimately lead to unprecedented crisis and the temporary eclipse of royal authority. As Edward I was laid to rest in Westminster Abbey, beneath the simple inscription, Hic jacet Edwardus Primus Scotorum Malleus, here lies Edward I of the Scots Malleus, first Hammer of the Scots. The kingdom he left behind was more unified, more prosperous, and more constitutionally advanced than ever before. Yet the seeds of future troubles had also been sown in the unresolved Scottish question and in the tensions between royal ambition and baronial resistance that would define much of the following century. The crown that descended to Edward II in July 1307 carried with it all the accumulated achievements and burdens of the Plantagenet dynasty. Yet the new king would prove tragically unsuited to bear these responsibilities, and his reign would witness a dramatic reversal of royal fortunes that culminated in unprecedented humiliation and the temporary triumph of baronial government over royal authority. Edward II possessed many admirable personal qualities. He was physically strong and athletically gifted, with particular enthusiasm for rowing, swimming, and other vigorous pursuits. He showed genuine affection for those close to him and could display considerable charm when he chose to do so. His interests extended to crafts and manual labor, activities that, while unusual for a king, demonstrated a practical intelligence that might have served him well in other circumstances. Yet these very qualities, admirable in themselves, proved problematic in a medieval king. Edward's preference for the company of craftsmen, grooms, and other common folk struck his nobles as undignified and inappropriate. His lack of interest in traditional aristocratic pursuits such as hunting and warfare created doubt about his fitness for kingship. Most seriously, his close relationships with particular favorites aroused suspicion and resentment among the baronial class, who expected to share royal confidence and influence. The first and most significant of these favorites was Piers Gaveston, a Gascon knight whom Edward I had banished, but whom Edward II immediately recalled upon his accession. Gaveston was undoubtedly talented, possessing wit, intelligence, and considerable personal charm. Yet his rapid elevation to the earldom of Cornwall and his apparent dominance over the young king created immediate opposition from established noble families who resented being displaced by a foreign upstart. The conflict over Gaveston escalated steadily during the early years of Edward's reign. The barons, led by Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, Edward I's nephew, and one of the most powerful magnates in England, demanded Gaveston's permanent exile and his exclusion from all influence over royal government. Edward's repeated attempts to protect his favourite, including several temporary exiles followed by equally dramatic recalls, demonstrated both his personal loyalty and his political inflexibility. The crisis reached its tragic climax in 1312, when a group of barons captured and executed Gaveston despite his surrender under promise of safe conduct. This judicial murder, for so it must be called, traumatized Edward and created a permanent breach between the king and many of his most powerful subjects. The execution also established a dangerous precedent that royal favorites could be eliminated through baronial action, undermining the principle of royal authority over appointments and patronage. Edward's marriage to Isabella of France in 1308 had initially promised political benefits through alliance with the French crown, but the relationship gradually deteriorated as Isabella became alienated from her husband's court and his successive favorites. Isabella was an intelligent and spirited woman who might have provided Edward with valuable counsel and support, but his emotional dependence on male favorites left little room for her influence or companionship. The military challenges inherited from Edward I's Scottish campaigns proved beyond Edward II's capabilities. The great victory won by Robert Bruce at Bannockburn in June 1314 was a disaster that effectively ended English hopes of conquering Scotland. Edward's personal performance in the battle was particularly criticized, as he appeared to flee the field while his soldiers continued fighting. This military humiliation damaged royal prestige throughout Europe and emboldened domestic opposition. The defeat at Bannockburn led directly to the dominance of Thomas of Lancaster, who effectively controlled English government for several years. Lancaster's administration proved both incompetent and oppressive, demonstrating that baronial government was no more effective than royal misrule. The Earl's inability to provide effective leadership against Scottish raids, combined with his harsh treatment of royal officials, gradually eroded his support among the nobility and commons alike. Edward's recovery of authority in the early 1320s was assisted by the emergence of new favourites, the Despensers, father and son, who possessed greater political skill than Gaveston, but whose greed and ruthlessness ultimately proved equally destructive. The younger Despenser in particular became the focus of baronial hatred as his influence over the king grew, and his accumulation of wealth and power reached unprecedented levels. The final crisis of Edward's reign began when Queen Isabella, ostensibly travelling to France on diplomatic business, refused to return to England, and instead allied herself with Roger Mortimer, an exiled English baron who had escaped from the Tower of London in dramatic circumstances. Their invasion of England in September 1326 was greeted with widespread support from nobles, clergy, and common people alike, demonstrating the extent of Edward's political isolation. The collapse of Edward's government was remarkably swift and complete. The Despensers were captured and executed. Edward himself was taken prisoner, and effective power passed to Isabella and Mortimer, ruling in the name of the 14-year-old Prince Edward, the future Edward III. The deposition of an anointed king was unprecedented in English history, requiring careful legal justification and the creation of new constitutional procedures. The Parliament that assembled in January 1327 to formalize Edward II's deposition faced the delicate task of removing a king without destroying the principle of monarchy itself. The solution involved a combination of forced abdication and parliamentary approval, creating precedents that would be remembered when later constitutional crises required resolution. Edward's alleged confession of his unfitness for kingship provided the legal fiction necessary to preserve the principle that kings ruled by divine right. Edward II's fate after his depositions remains shrouded in mystery and controversy. The official account stated that he died of natural causes while imprisoned at Berkeley Castle in September 1327, but contemporary rumours suggested murder, and some later chronicles claimed that he had escaped to live in exile on the continent. The truth may never be known, but the manner of his end became symbolic of the tragic nature of his entire reign. The regency government of Isabella and Mortimer that followed Edward II's deposition proved almost as unpopular as the deposed king's personal rule. Mortimer's accumulation of titles and wealth, his high-handed treatment of other nobles, and his domination over the young Edward III created new resentments that would soon explode into open conflict. Isabella, despite her crucial role in overthrowing her husband, found her influence gradually marginalized by her lover's ambitions. The resolution of this crisis came through the young Edward III's assertion of his royal authority in October 1330, when he seized Mortimer at Nottingham Castle and assumed personal rule. Isabella was treated with respect, but excluded from political influence, while Mortimer was executed for treason. The new king's dramatic coup demonstrated both political maturity beyond his 17 years and a determination to restore the dignity and effectiveness of royal government. Edward III's early actions revealed a clear understanding of the mistakes that had led to his father's downfall. He cultivated good relations with the baronial class while maintaining firm royal authority, avoided excessive dependence on individual favorites, and demonstrated military competence that restored royal prestige. His reign would witness the flowering of chivalric culture, military success in France, and the development of English national identity. The troubled reign of Edward II thus served as both a cautionary tale and a learning experience for English kingship. The constitutional developments forced by the crisis of royal authority, including the procedures for deposition and the strengthening of parliamentary oversight, would prove valuable when future kings exceeded their proper bounds. The reign also demonstrated that effective monarchy required not just legitimate authority, but also political skill, military competence, and to work constructively with the kingdom's natural leaders. As Edward III began his long and successful reign, the memory of his father's troubles would serve as a constant reminder of the dangers facing kings who failed to balance personal inclination with political necessity. The crown had been preserved, but the price of its survival had been the establishment of precedents that would forever limit royal authority and ensure that English kings could never again rule as absolute monarchs. The transformation of Edward III from the young king who had dramatically seized power from his mother and Mortimer into one of medieval England's most celebrated monarchs represents one of history's most remarkable royal achievements. His long reign, spanning 50 years from 1327 to 1377, would witness the flowering of chivalric culture, the beginning of the 100 Years' War with France, and the emergence of England as one of Europe's premier military powers. Edward's early years as king were marked by careful attention to healing the wounds left by his father's troubled reign. He demonstrated remarkable political maturity in his dealings with the nobility, showing respect for their traditional rights and privileges while maintaining firm royal authority. The king cultivated a court atmosphere that emphasized honor, courtesy, and martial prowess, creating an environment where the values of chivalry could flourish. The concept of chivalry that developed during Edward's reign represented more than simple military prowess. It encompassed ideals of courtesy toward women, protection of the weak, loyalty to one's lord, and devotion to Christian principles. These values found their most famous expression in Edward's foundation of the Order of the Garter, established around 1348 as an exclusive fellowship of knights bound together by common ideals and mutual loyalty. The Order of the Garter, with its famous motto, Honi soit qui mal y pense, shame on him who thinks evil of it, became a symbol of the chivalric culture that flourished at Edward's court. The elaborate ceremonies, magnificent regalia, and exclusive membership created a sense of elite identity that bound together the king and his greatest nobles in common purpose. The annual Garter Feast at Windsor Castle became one of the great social and political events of the medieval calendar. Edward's court attracted knights, poets, and scholars from across Europe, creating a cultural environment that rivaled the greatest royal courts of the continent. The king himself was an accomplished jouster and tournament competitor, regularly participating in the elaborate martial displays that were central to chivalric culture. These tournaments served both as entertainment and as training for warfare, maintaining the military skills that would prove crucial in the campaigns to come. The question of Edward's claim to the French throne provided the immediate cause for the conflict that would become known as the 100 Years' War. Through his mother Isabella, Edward possessed a credible claim to the French crown, which had passed to Philip VI of Valois in 1328. While Edward had initially accepted Philip's accession, changing political circumstances and growing tensions over English possessions in France led him to assert his claim more aggressively. The formal beginning of the 100 Years' War in 1337 marked the opening of what would become one of the defining conflicts of the later Middle Ages. Yet in these early years, the war consisted more of raids, sieges, and diplomatic maneuvering than of the great pitched battles that would later capture popular imagination. Edward's strategy focused on demonstrating his ability to wage effective war in France while building alliances with French nobles who might support his claim. The great English victory at the Battle of Sluys in 1340 established Edward's forces as masters of the English Channel and demonstrated the effectiveness of English military innovation. The battle was fought primarily as a naval encounter, but English longbowmen proved devastatingly effective against French knights and crossbowmen. This victory secured English communications with the continent and enabled the larger military expeditions that would follow. The development of the English longbow during Edward's reign revolutionized medieval warfare and gave English armies a significant advantage over their continental opponents. These weapons, typically standing as tall as a man and requiring years of training to master effectively, could penetrate armor at distances that made traditional cavalry charges extremely hazardous. The social implications were also significant, as the effectiveness of common archers elevated the military importance of England's free peasantry. The great victory at Crécy in August 1346 demonstrated the full potential of English military innovation and tactical flexibility. Facing a French army that significantly outnumbered his own forces, Edward chose a defensive position that maximized the advantages of his longbowmen while minimizing French superiority in heavy cavalry. The result was a crushing victory that shocked European military observers and established England's reputation as the continent's premier military power. The aftermath of Crécy saw Edward's forces laying siege to Calais, the French port that controlled access to the English Channel. The siege, lasting nearly a year, demonstrated English determination to establish a permanent foothold in France rather than simply conducting profitable raids. The eventual surrender of Calais in August 1347 provided England with a crucial base for future operations and a valuable centre for English trade with the continent. The famous story of the burghers of Calais, who offered their lives to save their city, illustrates the human drama that accompanied these great military events. Edward's initial harsh intentions were reportedly softened by Queen Philippa's intervention, demonstrating the tempering influence that royal women could exercise over the conduct of warfare. The story, whether entirely accurate or embellished in later telling, became part of the chivalric legend that surrounded Edward's reign. The capture of the French king John II at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356 represented the zenith of English military success during the first phase of the 100 Years' War. Edward's son, known to history as the Black Prince, commanded the English forces that won this remarkable victory against overwhelming odds. The capture of an anointed king was an almost unprecedented achievement that brought enormous prestige to the English crown and substantial financial benefits through ransom negotiations. The chivalric treatment of the captured French king at the English court demonstrated the ideals that Edward sought to embody in his conduct of warfare. John II was treated with honor and courtesy appropriate to his rank, housed in comfort, and allowed to maintain a royal court even in captivity. This behavior was not merely ceremonial, but reflected genuine belief in the chivalric code that governed relations between Christian nobles, even in wartime. The Treaty of Bretigny, concluded in 1360, represented the high point of English success in the 100 Years' War. The agreement provided for the release of the French king in exchange for an enormous ransom, while also granting England full sovereignty over an expanded Duchy of Aquitaine and several other French territories. For a time, it seemed that Edward's claims to French territory had been vindicated through military success and diplomatic negotiation. The internal development of England during Edward's reign proceeded alongside these foreign military adventures. The king's frequent absences on campaign in France required the development of more sophisticated systems of government that could function effectively without constant royal supervision. Parliament grew in importance as Edward needed frequent grants of taxation to support his military campaigns, while the administrative machinery of government became more professional and efficient. The cultural achievements of Edward's reign extended far beyond the court ceremonies and tournaments that marked chivalric society. The period saw significant developments in English literature, with poets like Geoffrey Chaucer beginning to create works that would define English literary culture for centuries. The architectural achievements of the period included the completion of several great cathedrals and the construction of magnificent secular buildings that demonstrated England's growing wealth and artistic sophistication. The economic prosperity that supported Edward's military campaigns rested on England's position as Europe's primary supplier of high-quality wool. The wealth generated by wool exports provided the financial foundation for the costly expeditions to France, while also supporting the magnificent court culture that characterized the reign. The development of English cloth manufacturing during this period began the transformation that would eventually make England a major industrial as well as agricultural economy. The later years of Edward's reign saw some decline in military fortunes as France recovered from its earlier defeats and began to develop more effective responses to English military tactics. The resumption of hostilities after the expiration of the Treaty of Bretigny led to a series of campaigns that proved less decisive than the great victories of the 1340s and 1350s. Yet England's position as a major European power remained secure, and the chivalric culture established during Edward's reign continued to flourish. The reign of Edward III thus established patterns that would define English kingship and English national identity for generations to come. The combination of military prowess, chivalric ideals, and cultural achievement created a template for royal success that later kings would strive to emulate. The development of Parliament, the professionalization of government, and the growth of English wealth and influence laid foundations that would support the kingdom through the challenges that lay ahead. As Edward aged and his direct involvement in military campaigns diminished, the question of succession began to occupy the minds of nobles and commons alike. The Black Prince, heir apparent and hero of Poitiers, had proven his capabilities both as a military commander and as a ruler during his time governing English possessions in France. Yet fate would decree that this accomplished prince would predecease his father, creating succession complications that would ultimately lead to the dynastic conflicts known as the Wars of the Roses. The England that had flourished under Edward III's long reign, with its chivalric courts and military triumphs, faced an unprecedented challenge in the middle years of the 14th century. From across the continent came reports of a terrible pestilence that was advancing steadily westward, leaving behind a trail of empty villages and silent cities. This was the Black Death, perhaps the most devastating pandemic in human history, and its arrival in England would forever change the character of medieval society. The Great Mortality, as contemporary chroniclers often called it, first appeared in England at the port of Melcombe Regis in Dorset during the summer of 1348. A ship arriving from the continent brought not only its cargo of goods, but also the deadly disease that had already ravaged much of Europe. From this initial landing, the plague spread with terrifying speed throughout the kingdom, following the ancient routes of trade and pilgrimage that connected every corner of the realm. The disease itself was poorly understood by medieval medicine, which lacked the knowledge to comprehend its true nature or devise effective treatments. What people observed was a terrible affliction that struck suddenly and killed swiftly, often within days of the first symptoms appearing. The characteristic swellings, the dark discoloration of the skin, and the agonizing death that followed created fear and panic wherever the disease appeared. In our gentle telling of this tragic chapter, we focus not on the horrific details of suffering, but on the human responses to unprecedented crisis. Communities that had known stability for generations suddenly found themselves facing the loss of neighbors, friends, and family members with bewildering rapidity. The normal rhythms of life, the seasonal patterns of work and celebration that had defined medieval existence, were disrupted as entire villages struggled to comprehend and respond to catastrophe. The Church, which provided both spiritual comfort and practical assistance in times of crisis, found itself overwhelmed by the scale of the disaster. Priests and monks who ministered to the sick and dying often fell victim to the disease themselves, leaving communities without spiritual guidance at the moment of greatest need. Many churches stood empty on Sundays, as both clergy and congregations succumbed to the plague or fled in search of safety that could not be found. The economic consequences of the plague were immediate and profound. Fields that had been carefully cultivated for generations lay unharvested, as the workers who had tended them were no longer alive to complete the year's labor. Mills fell silent as the millers who had operated them for decades succumbed to the disease, while markets that had bustled with activity became ghostly gatherings where few dared to venture. The demographic impact of the Black Death on England was staggering. Modern estimates suggest that between 1/3 and 1/2 of the population perished during the plague years of 1348 to 1351, though the mortality varied significantly from region to region. Some communities were virtually wiped out entirely, their names surviving only in administrative records and the grass-covered foundations of abandoned churches. Others, through chance or isolation, suffered less severely and provided refuges of continuity in a transformed landscape. The psychological impact of such massive mortality was perhaps even more significant than the immediate economic disruption. People who had lived their entire lives in stable communities, where everyone knew their neighbors and their place in the social order, suddenly found themselves in a world where familiar faces had vanished and established relationships had been severed by death. The comfortable predictability of medieval life, with its seasonal rhythms and generational continuity, had been shattered. Yet human resilience and adaptability proved remarkable even in the face of such catastrophe. Survivors began the slow process of rebuilding their communities, often in ways that differed significantly from pre-plague patterns. Villages that had lost most of their population were sometimes abandoned entirely, with the remaining inhabitants moving to more viable settlements. Others were reconstituted with new residents who had fled from even more devastated areas. The Church showed extraordinary dedication in ministering to plague victims, despite the enormous risks involved. Many clergy died performing their pastoral duties, visiting the sick, administering last rites, and providing what comfort they could to the dying and bereaved. This sacrifice earned the Church enormous respect from survivors, even as the loss of so many experienced priests and monks created practical problems that would take years to resolve. The social changes that followed the Black Death were gradual but profound. The massive reduction in population created unprecedented opportunities for social mobility, as positions left vacant by the dead needed to be filled by survivors, regardless of their traditional social status. Peasants found themselves able to demand better terms from landlords who desperately needed workers to maintain their estates. Craftsmen and merchants could command higher wages and better working conditions in a labor market suddenly dominated by scarcity rather than surplus. The attempt by authorities to maintain pre-plague social and economic relationships through legislation proved largely futile. The Statute of Labourers, enacted in 1351, tried to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and prevent workers from moving freely in search of better conditions. However, the simple reality of supply and demand made such restrictions unenforceable in practice. Workers who had survived the plague found themselves in unprecedented positions of strength in negotiating their terms of employment. The cultural impact of the Black Death was equally significant, though it manifested more slowly than the immediate social and economic changes. The experience of mass mortality created a heightened awareness of death and the transitory nature of earthly existence. This perspective found expression in art, literature, and religious practice, with themes of mortality and the afterlife becoming more prominent in cultural production. The development of what scholars call the ars moriendi tradition, the art of dying well, reflected this new preoccupation with death and judgment. Religious texts focusing on preparation for death became more common, while artistic representations of death, including the famous Danse macabre or Dance of Death, appeared throughout Europe. These cultural developments represented attempts to come to terms with the trauma of mass mortality and find meaning in the face of apparent chaos. The plague also had significant effects on religious faith and practice. Some people lost faith entirely in the face of such overwhelming suffering, questioning how a just God could permit such catastrophe. Others found their faith deepened by the experience, viewing the plague as a divine judgment that called for repentance and spiritual renewal. Many communities organized elaborate processions and ceremonies designed to win divine favor and protection from further visitations of the disease. The economic opportunities created by population decline led to significant changes in agricultural practices. The abundance of available land meant that the least productive areas could be abandoned in favor of the most fertile, leading to more intensive cultivation of the best soils. This agricultural concentration often proved more efficient than the previous system of cultivating marginal lands out of necessity, contributing to improved productivity per worker in the post-plague economy. Urban areas experienced their own patterns of change and adaptation. Cities that had been overcrowded before the plague found themselves with surplus housing and vacant commercial properties, allowing for improved living conditions for survivors. The reduced competition for urban resources often meant that those who remained could enjoy higher standards of living than had been possible in the pre-plague period. The guild system that had regulated urban crafts and trades was forced to adapt to the new realities of reduced membership and altered market conditions. Many guilds relaxed their traditional restrictions on membership and training, allowing faster advancement and greater flexibility in response to labor shortages. These changes often proved permanent, contributing to the gradual modernization of urban economic structures. The political consequences of the Black Death were complex and varied. Royal government continued to function, though with considerable difficulty in some regions where local officials had died. The collection of taxes became more challenging as traditional assessment methods were disrupted by population changes, while the need for revenue remained high due to ongoing military commitments in France. Parliament adapted to the changed circumstances by gradually becoming more responsive to the needs and concerns of a transformed society. The Commons, representing the interests of merchants, craftsmen, and free peasants who had gained influence as a result of the plague, began to play a more active role in royal government. This development would have lasting consequences for English constitutional development. The international context of the plague created both challenges and opportunities for English foreign policy. France had suffered equally from the pestilence, reducing the military pressure on English possessions there, while also limiting England's ability to take advantage of French weakness. The temporary truce that followed the plague years reflected the simple reality that both kingdoms needed time to recover before resuming active hostilities. The recovery from the Black Death proceeded slowly but steadily throughout the 1350s and 1360s. New marriages formed to replace those broken by death, children were born to replace the lost population, and abandoned lands gradually returned to cultivation. The process was uneven and often difficult, but it demonstrated the fundamental resilience of medieval society and its capacity for renewal even after catastrophic disruption. By the later years of Edward III's reign, England had largely adapted to its transformed demographic and social landscape. The population remained significantly smaller than it had been before the plague, but the survivors had created new patterns of life that often proved more prosperous and flexible than those that had existed before. The plague had been a terrible tragedy, but it had also created opportunities for social and economic development that might not otherwise have existed. The memory of the Black Death would remain vivid in English consciousness for generations, influencing art, literature, and religious practice long after the immediate effects had faded. The experience had demonstrated both human vulnerability in the face of natural catastrophe and the remarkable capacity for adaptation and renewal that would carry English society forward into the centuries to come. As the 1360s progressed and the immediate crisis of the plague years receded into memory, England began to grapple with new challenges that had emerged from the social transformations wrought by the Great Mortality. The survivors had created a different kind of society, one with altered power relationships and changed expectations that would soon test the flexibility of traditional forms of authority and social organization. The England that emerged from the shadow of the Black Death was a realm transformed in ways both visible and subtle. The survivors of the Great Mortality had rebuilt their communities and adapted to new circumstances. But beneath the surface of renewed prosperity lay tensions that would eventually burst forth in the most significant popular uprising in medieval English history. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 would shake the foundations of the social order and demonstrate that the common people had found their voice in the aftermath of plague and transformation. The reign of Richard II, which began when he was still a child of 10 in 1377, inherited both the glories and the problems created by his grandfather Edward III's long rule. The young king's minority was managed by a regency council that struggled with the complex legacy of the 100 Years' War, the social changes wrought by the Black Death, and the growing financial demands of royal government. These challenges would create the conditions that led ordinary people to question the established order in unprecedented ways. The immediate cause of a popular unrest was the poll tax imposed by Parliament in 1380, a levy that demanded the same amount from every adult regardless of their wealth or social status. This tax fell most heavily on the poor, who found themselves required to pay sums that represented significant portions of their annual income. The collection of this tax in 1381 created widespread resentment and provided the spark that ignited long-simmering grievances throughout the kingdom. Yet the deeper causes of the revolt lay in the social and economic changes that had followed the plague. The survivors of the Black Death had discovered that their labor was valuable in ways it had never been before, and many had prospered through their to demand better wages and working conditions. However, the traditional authorities, both secular and ecclesiastical, had attempted to prevent these changes through legislation and force, creating a fundamental conflict between old forms of control and new economic realities. The leaders who emerged during the uprising were not the desperate outcasts that hostile chroniclers sometimes portrayed, but often prosperous peasants and craftsmen who had achieved some measure of success within the existing system, but found their aspirations blocked by traditional restrictions. Wat Tyler, the most famous of the rebel leaders, appears to have been a man of some substance and education, capable of articulating sophisticated political and social arguments, rather than simply expressing inchoate rage. The initial uprising began in Kent and Essex during May 1381, spreading with remarkable speed throughout much of southeastern England. The rebels showed considerable organization and discipline, often targeting specific symbols of oppression rather than engaging in random violence. Tax collectors, lawyers, and administrative records were particular targets, reflecting the rebels' understanding that their grievances were fundamentally about systems of authority and control rather than individual personalities. The rebels' march on London represented an extraordinary moment in medieval history, when common people successfully challenged the authority of king and nobles in the very heart of the kingdom. The opening of the city gates to the rebel army reflected considerable sympathy for their cause among London's common citizens, who shared many of the same grievances against taxation and restrictive social policies. The famous meeting between Richard II and the rebels at Mile End on June 14, 1381, demonstrated both the young king's personal courage and the rebels' desire for legitimate resolution of their grievances. Richard, though only 14 years old, showed remarkable composure in facing a crowd of armed commoners who had effectively taken control of his capital city. His willingness to negotiate directly with rebel leaders suggested a recognition that their concerns deserved serious attention. The demands presented by the rebels at Mile End were radical for their time, but not entirely unreasonable given the changed circumstances of post-plague England. They sought the abolition of serfdom, the reduction of rents to reasonable levels, the freedom to trade without restrictive guild regulations, and pardons for their rebellion. These demands reflected a sophisticated understanding of the economic and legal obstacles that prevented common people from enjoying the prosperity that their labor had created. The tragic confrontation at Smithfield the following day, which resulted in Wat Tyler's death, marked the beginning of the revolt's collapse, but not the end of its significance. The circumstances of Tyler's death remain disputed, but his killing during negotiations with the king created a martyr whose memory would inspire later generations of English radicals and reformers. The young Richard's ability to persuade the remaining rebels to disperse demonstrated both political skill and the continuing power of royal authority when properly exercised. The suppression that followed the revolt's collapse was carried out with considerable restraint by medieval standards. While some rebel leaders were executed and some participants punished, the wholesale slaughter that might have been expected did not materialize. Many of the king's advisers recognized that the revolt had expressed legitimate grievances that required attention rather than simply punishment. In the years following the revolt, many of the changes that the rebels had demanded actually came to pass through gradual social and economic evolution rather than formal legislation. Serfdom continued to decline as landlords found free wage labor more profitable than forced service, while guild restrictions gradually relaxed in response to economic realities. The revolt had not achieved its immediate goals through force, but it had articulated aspirations that would ultimately be realized through the normal processes of social change. The cultural impact of the peasants' revolt extended far beyond its immediate political consequences. The uprising demonstrated that common people could organize effectively, articulate sophisticated political positions, and challenge established authority when their circumstances required it. This knowledge would remain part of English popular consciousness, available to inspire future generations when similar circumstances arose. The revolt also influenced the development of English political thought, contributing to discussions about the nature of royal authority, the rights of subjects, and the proper relationship between different social classes. Writers and thinkers began to grapple more seriously with questions about social justice and political legitimacy that the revolt had brought into sharp focus. Richard II's personal experience of the revolt appears to have influenced his later development as a king, though not always in positive ways. His success in dealing with the rebels may have convinced him that he possessed exceptional abilities and that his authority derived directly from God rather than from the consent of his subjects. This conviction would ultimately contribute to the constitutional crisis that ended his reign in deposition and exile. The economic changes that had helped cause the revolt continued to accelerate in its aftermath. England's transformation from a primarily agricultural economy to one that included significant commercial and manufacturing sectors proceeded more rapidly as traditional restrictions lost their effectiveness. The prosperity that this transformation created was distributed more broadly than ever before, though it remained concentrated in the hands of landlords, merchants, and successful craftsmen. The Church's response to the revolt was complex and varied. Some clergy had supported the rebels' demands for social justice, viewing them as consistent with Christian teachings about the dignity of all people and the obligation of the wealthy to care for the poor. Others had condemned the revolt as a violation of the divinely ordained social order. These differing responses reflected broader tensions within the Church about its proper role in secular affairs. The international context of the revolt was also significant, as similar uprisings occurred in other parts of Europe during the same period. The Jacquerie in France, urban revolts in Flanders, and peasant rebellions in various German territories suggested that the social tensions unleashed by the Black Death were not unique to England. These parallel developments demonstrated that traditional forms of authority were under pressure throughout Western Europe. The legal and administrative changes that followed the revolt were often subtle but significant. Royal officials became more careful about the methods they used to collect taxes and enforce royal policies, recognizing that excessive harshness could provoke dangerous resistance. Local authorities also learned to be more responsive to popular concerns, understanding that ignoring legitimate grievances could lead to more serious problems. The memory of 1381 remained vivid in English consciousness for generations, influencing how both rulers and subjects thought about the proper limits of authority and resistance. The revolt had demonstrated that the English people would not passively accept unlimited oppression, but it had also shown that they preferred negotiation and reform to violence and destruction when given the opportunity to seek redress through legitimate means. As Richard II matured from the courageous boy who had faced the rebels at Mile End into an increasingly autocratic adult king, the lessons of the revolt seemed to fade from his memory. His later attempts to rule without the consent of Parliament and his harsh treatment of political opponents would ultimately provoke the constitutional crisis that ended the Plantagenet dynasty and ushered in the era of dynastic warfare known as the Wars of the Roses. The whispers of rebellion that had grown into the roar of popular uprising in 1381 would eventually be heard again in different forms and circumstances. The idea that common people possessed rights that even kings must respect, and that unjust authority could legitimately be resisted, had taken root in English soil, where it would continue to grow through the centuries to come. The deposition of Richard II in 1399 marked the beginning of a new and turbulent chapter in English history, one that would see the crown contested between rival branches of the royal family for nearly a century. The Wars of the Roses, as later historians would name this period of intermittent civil conflict, emerged not from any single cause, but from the gradual accumulation of tensions over royal authority, noble privilege, and the proper succession to the throne of England. Henry Bolingbroke's seizure of the crown from his cousin Richard II created the Lancastrian dynasty, but it also established a precedent for deposing anointed kings that would haunt English politics for generations. Henry IV, as Bolingbroke became upon his coronation, faced immediate challenges to his authority from those who questioned his right to rule and from the practical difficulties of governing a kingdom where royal legitimacy had been called into question. The early years of Henry IV's reign were marked by repeated rebellions and conspiracies as various nobles and foreign powers attempted to exploit the uncertain foundations of Lancastrian rule. The king's need to maintain military readiness against internal threats limited his ability to pursue the ambitious foreign policies that had characterized earlier reigns, while the financial costs of suppressing rebellion strained the royal treasury and required frequent appeals to Parliament for additional taxation. The most serious challenge to Henry's authority came from the Percy family, the powerful earls of Northumberland who had initially supported Bolingbroke's usurpation, but later became alienated from the new regime. The rebellion led by Henry Percy, known as Hotspur, culminated in the Battle of Shrewsbury in 1403, where the king's forces achieved victory but at considerable cost. Hotspur's death in battle eliminated a dangerous enemy, but also created a martyr whose memory would inspire future resistance to Lancastrian rule. Henry IV's health began to decline in his later years, possibly due to a skin condition that contemporary chroniclers sometimes interpreted as divine punishment for his usurpation of the throne. The king's periodic incapacitation created opportunities for his son, the future Henry V, to gain experience in government and military affairs. But it also contributed to political instability, as nobles questioned who actually held effective authority in the kingdom. The accession of Henry V in 1413 brought to the throne a king whose abilities and achievements would restore much of the prestige that the monarchy had lost during the troubles of Richard II's later years and the uncertain beginnings of Lancastrian rule. Henry possessed the rare combination of military genius, political skill, and personal charisma that enabled him to unite his kingdom and lead it to unprecedented success in foreign warfare. Henry V's revival of English claims to the French throne and his invasion of France in 1415 represented both a continuation of the 100 Years' War and a masterful solution to the domestic problems that had plagued his father's reign. By directing noble energies toward foreign conquest rather than domestic intrigue, Henry created opportunities for military service and advancement that helped reconcile potential opponents to Lancastrian rule. The great victory at Agincourt on October 25, 1415, established Henry V as one of history's most celebrated military commanders, while demonstrating once again the effectiveness of English longbowmen against traditional continental military tactics. The battle was fought against overwhelming odds, with English forces significantly outnumbered by their French opponents. Yet superior tactics and discipline led to a victory so complete that it shocked all of Christian Europe. The systematic conquest of Normandy that followed Agincourt demonstrated Henry's abilities as both a military strategist and a civil administrator. Rather than simply conducting profitable raids, as earlier English kings had often done, Henry established effective governance over conquered territories, rebuilding towns and castles while creating administrative systems that could maintain English authority over the long term. The Treaty of Troy, concluded in 1420, represented the pinnacle of English success in the 100 Years' War. The agreement recognized Henry as heir to the French throne and regent of France during the lifetime of the mentally incapacitated Charles VI, while also arranging Henry's marriage to Catherine of Valois, the French king's daughter. For a brief moment, it seemed that the English and French crowns would be united under a single ruler. Yet Henry V's premature death in August 1422, while campaigning to consolidate English gains in France, created a succession crisis that would ultimately undermine all of his achievements. The new king, Henry VI, was less than a year old, requiring a lengthy regency that divided authority between the king's uncles and created opportunities for the factional conflicts that would eventually explode into civil war. The regency government that ruled during Henry VI's minority was generally capable and conscientious, maintaining domestic stability while continuing the war in France with reasonable success. The Duke of Bedford's governance of English France proved particularly effective, demonstrating that Henry V's conquests could be maintained through skillful administration and military competence. Yet the fundamental problems created by minority rule remained unresolved. Henry VI's assumption of personal rule in the early 1430s revealed a king whose character was fundamentally unsuited to the demands of medieval kingship. Unlike his warrior father, Henry was gentle, pious, and scholarly, more interested in founding educational institutions than in leading armies. While these qualities were admirable in themselves, they proved inadequate for governing a kingdom facing the challenges of foreign war and domestic tension. The gradual loss of English territories in France during the 1440s and 1450s created domestic political problems as nobles who had invested heavily in French campaigns faced financial ruin and social disgrace. The final collapse of English authority in France, marked by defeats at Formigny and Castillon, ended the 100 Years' War in comprehensive English failure and contributed to the growing perception that Henry VI's government was ineffective and unsuccessful. The king's marriage to Margaret of Anjou in 1445, while initially celebrated as a diplomatic triumph, ultimately contributed to political instability when Margaret proved unable to produce an heir for several years. The Queen's strong personality and her preference for particular court favourites also created resentment among nobles who felt excluded from royal favour and influence. The emergence of Richard, Duke of York, as the leader of opposition to Henry VI's government reflected both personal ambition and genuine concern about the kingdom's deteriorating condition. York possessed a strong claim to the throne through his descent from Edward III, while his experience as a military commander and administrator in France and Ireland had demonstrated his competence in ways that contrasted sharply with Henry VI's evident weaknesses. The first outbreak of armed conflict between Yorkist and Lancastrian forces occurred at the Battle of St. Albans in May 1455, where York's supporters defeated royal forces and captured the king himself. This engagement was relatively small in scale and limited in duration, but it established the precedent for settling political disputes through armed force rather than negotiation and compromise. Henry VI's periodic bouts of mental illness, beginning in 1453, created additional complications for royal government and succession. During these episodes, the king became completely incapacitated, unable to recognize even his closest associates or participate in government in any meaningful way. York's appointment as protector during these periods gave him experience of royal authority, while also creating suspicions about his ultimate intentions. The birth of Edward, Prince of Wales, in 1453 initially seemed to resolve the succession question, but ultimately created new sources of conflict as Yorkist supporters questioned the child's paternity, while Lancastrian supporters used his existence to justify increasingly aggressive measures against potential rivals. Queen Margaret's fierce protection of her son's interests led her to become the de facto leader of the Lancastrian cause, demonstrating political skills that her husband conspicuously lacked. The escalation of the conflict during the late 1450s transformed what had begun as a factional dispute into a genuine dynastic war, as both sides sought decisive military solutions to their political disagreements. The battles of Blore Heath, Ludford Bridge, and Northampton demonstrated that the kingdom had entered a period of sustained civil warfare that would continue until one side achieved complete victory over the other. The dramatic events of 1460 to 1461, including Richard of York's death at the Battle of Wakefield and his son's subsequent victory at Towton, marked the transformation of the Wars of the Roses from a series of noble rebellions into a struggle for the survival of competing royal dynasties. The young Edward of York's coronation as Edward IV represented not just a change of ruler, but the replacement of one royal house by another. Edward IV's early reign demonstrated the energy and military skill that had enabled the Yorkist victory, but it also revealed the challenges facing any king who had gained his throne through force rather than undisputed inheritance. The new king needed to reconcile former enemies while rewarding loyal supporters, maintain military readiness against Lancastrian plots while governing effectively in peacetime, and establish his dynasty's legitimacy while ruling over subjects who might question his right to the crown. The temporary restoration of Henry VI in 1470 to 1471, orchestrated by the Earl of Warwick in alliance with Queen Margaret, demonstrated that the Yorkist victory was not as complete as it had initially appeared. Edward IV's flight to Burgundy seemed to mark the end of his reign, yet his successful return and the decisive battles of Barnet and Tewkesbury established Yorkist rule on firmer foundations than ever before. The mysterious deaths of Henry VI and his son Prince Edward in 1471 effectively ended the direct Lancastrian line and removed the immediate threat to Edward IV's throne. The subsequent years of peace and prosperity demonstrated Edward's considerable abilities as a peacetime king, while the growth of trade and the recovery from the disruptions of civil war showed England's fundamental resilience and adaptability. Edward IV's death in April 1483, while still relatively young, created the succession crisis that would lead to the final act of the Wars of the Roses. The brief reign of the boy king Edward V, the mysterious disappearance of the princes in the Tower, and the controversial accession of Richard III set the stage for the climactic confrontation that would finally resolve the dynastic conflicts that had plagued England for decades. The summer of 1485 found England once again poised on the brink of dynastic change, as Henry Tudor prepared to stake his slender claim to the throne against the established rule of Richard III. The landing at Mill Bay in Pembrokeshire on August 7th marked the beginning of the final campaign in the long struggle between Lancaster and York, though few could have predicted that this modest invasion force would succeed where so many previous challengers had failed. Henry Tudor's claim to the throne rested on tenuous foundations that would have seemed insufficient in more stable times. Through his mother, Margaret Beaufort, he descended from John of Gaunt and his mistress, Catherine Swynford, a line that had been legitimised but also excluded from the succession by Parliamentary Act. His father, Edmund Tudor, had brought Welsh royal blood, but no English claim. Yet in the fractured politics of late 15th century England, even weak hereditary rights could provide the basis for successful challenge when combined with military skill and political opportunity. The exile that had shaped Henry's character began in his earliest childhood, when the victory of Edward IV had made England unsafe for those with Lancastrian connections. The court of Duke Francis II of Brittany provided refuge, but also isolation from the kingdom he might one day hope to rule. This separation from England lasted for over a quarter-century, creating a claimant whose understanding of his potential realm came more from reports and correspondence than from direct experience. The opportunity for return came through the growing unpopularity of Richard III's rule and the specific crisis created by the fate of the princes in the Tower. The disappearance of Edward V and his brother Richard created uncertainty about the succession, while raising questions about their uncle's role in their vanishing. Whether Richard was responsible for their deaths or merely failed to protect them adequately, the shadow cast over his reign by their fate weakened his position and encouraged opposition. Henry's invasion benefited from careful preparation and shrewd political calculation. His promise to marry Elizabeth of York, daughter of Edward IV, offered the possibility of uniting the competing dynastic claims while appealing to those who sought an end to civil conflict. The support of Margaret Beaufort, working within England to prepare for her son's arrival, provided crucial intelligence and organizational assistance that would prove invaluable in the coming campaign. The march from Pembrokeshire toward the heart of England demonstrated Henry's political skill as much as his military capabilities. Rather than advancing directly toward London, he moved through Wales, gathering support from families and communities that had connections to his Welsh ancestry. The decision to display the red dragon banner of Cadwaladr alongside the royal arms of England symbolized his appeal to Welsh sentiment while asserting his claim to the English crown. The response to Henry's advance revealed the extent to which Richard III's support had eroded during his brief reign. Many nobles who might have been expected to rally to the established king instead remained neutral or actively supported the challenger. The defection of the Stanley family, whose late decision to support Henry would prove crucial at Bosworth, illustrated the conditional nature of loyalty in an age when dynastic legitimacy had been repeatedly called into question. The Battle of Bosworth Field, fought on August 22, 1485, would prove to be one of the most consequential engagements in English history, though its scale was modest compared to earlier battles of the Wars of the Roses. The armies were relatively small, reflecting the war weariness of a kingdom that had endured decades of intermittent civil conflict. Yet the outcome would establish a new dynasty that would rule England for over a century and transform the kingdom into one of Europe's most powerful nations. Richard III's death on the battlefield, fighting courageously to the end, eliminated not only a rival claimant, but also the last Plantagenet King of England. The discovery of his body among the fallen, stripped of royal regalia but identified by contemporary witnesses, marked the end of a dynasty that had ruled England for over 3 centuries. The crown that was reportedly found on the battlefield and placed on Henry's head symbolized the transfer of royal authority from one house to another. Henry VII's coronation at Westminster Abbey on October 30th, 1485, was carefully orchestrated to emphasize both continuity with previous reigns and the inauguration of a new era in English history. The ceremony followed traditional forms while incorporating elements that stressed Henry's particular claims to legitimacy. The presence of representatives from throughout the kingdom, including many who had previously supported Richard III, demonstrated the new king's success in winning acceptance for his rule. The early challenges facing the Tudor dynasty required careful navigation between competing interests and expectations. Henry needed to reward those who had supported his cause without alienating those who had served his predecessor, establish effective governance while maintaining the military readiness necessary to defend his crown, and create financial stability while funding the expenses of royal government and court magnificence. The marriage between Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, celebrated in January 1486, represented more than the fulfillment of a campaign promise. The union of the Red Rose of Lancaster and the White Rose of York, as later propaganda would characterize it, symbolized the healing of the wounds created by decades of civil warfare. Elizabeth brought to the marriage not only her father's bloodline, but also the loyalty of those who remembered Edward IV's successful reign. The birth of Prince Arthur in September 1486 provided the new dynasty with an heir whose very existence helped to stabilize Henry's rule. Named after the legendary British king, whose return had long been prophesied, Arthur represented the hope that the Tudor dynasty would bring lasting peace and prosperity to England. His upbringing and education were carefully planned to prepare him for kingship, while emphasizing the stability and continuity of Tudor rule. The suppression of remaining Yorkist challenges, including the rebellions associated with Lambert Simnel and Perkin Warbeck, demonstrated both the persistence of dynastic opposition and Henry VII's skill in dealing with threats to his authority. These pretenders, whether genuinely convinced of their royal birth or cynical opportunists, found support among those who remained dissatisfied with Tudor rule, yet their ultimate failure established the new dynasty's security more firmly than any peaceful transition could have done. Henry VII's approach to governance combined traditional medieval concepts of kingship with innovations that would characterize early modern monarchy. His careful attention to financial administration, his use of bonds and recognizances to ensure noble loyalty, and his development of conciliar government demonstrated a systematic approach to royal authority that differed markedly from the more personal and charismatic styles of his predecessors. The economic policies of the early Tudor period reflected Henry's understanding that royal authority required solid financial foundations. The encouragement of trade, the careful management of royal revenues, and the accumulation of treasure that would characterize his reign created resources that would enable his successors to pursue ambitious policies at home and abroad. The prosperity that England enjoyed during the later years of Henry's reign provided evidence that stable government could produce material benefits for both crown and subjects. The cultural changes that began during Henry VII's reign, though often subtle, would prove significant for the future development of English society. The increased use of English rather than French or Latin in official documents, the encouragement of printing and literacy, and the gradual development of a more sophisticated court culture laid foundations for the remarkable flowering of English civilization that would occur under Henry's successors. The international recognition that Henry VII gradually achieved demonstrated that the Tudor dynasty had succeeded in establishing itself as a legitimate member of the European royal family. Diplomatic marriages, including Arthur's betrothal to Catherine of Aragon and the various negotiations for other royal matches, showed that foreign powers accepted Henry as a legitimate king whose dynasty was likely to endure. The death of Prince Arthur in 1502 created a succession crisis that was resolved by the recognition of his younger brother Henry as heir apparent, yet it also demonstrated the fragility of dynastic continuity even in apparently stable circumstances. The careful education and preparation of the future Henry VIII reflected his father's understanding that the Tudor dynasty's survival required capable successors who could maintain the achievements of the founding generation. Henry VII's death in April 1509 marked the peaceful transition of power from the dynasty's founder to his son, a transfer of authority that validated the stability that the first Tudor king had worked so carefully to create. The 24 years of his reign had transformed England from a war-torn kingdom with disputed succession into a stable and prosperous realm whose position in European affairs was secure and respected. The new dawn that had risen at Bosworth Field had fulfilled its promise, creating the foundations for the remarkable achievements of the Tudor age that would follow. The medieval period in English history was drawing to its close, yet the institutions, traditions, and national identity that had developed over the centuries since the Norman Conquest would continue to shape England's development in the centuries to come. As Henry VIII ascended the throne amid celebrations that marked both personal succession and national renewal, the long story of medieval England reached its gentle conclusion. The age of knights and castles, of crusades and feudal obligations, of civil wars and dynastic conflicts, was giving way to an era of Renaissance learning, religious reformation, and global exploration. Yet the foundations laid during the medieval centuries would endure, providing the solid bedrock upon which England's future greatness would be built. The quiet transformation from medieval to early modern England proceeded without fanfare or dramatic announcement, marked more by gradual change than by revolutionary rupture. The institutions that had developed under medieval kings continued to evolve. The laws that had emerged from centuries of precedent continued to govern, and the people whose ancestors had witnessed the Norman Conquest continued to inhabit the same landscapes, though now as subjects of a new dynasty whose reign would carry England forward into a different world. In the peaceful silence that follows great events, as the echoes of Bosworth Field faded into memory and the new reign began its own story, England rested in the quiet satisfaction of a realm that had found stability after centuries of struggle. The medieval age had ended, not with catastrophe or collapse, but with the gentle transition that marks the natural conclusion of one great chapter in the long story of a nation. The Tudors had arrived, and with them, the dawn of a new era in the life of England. And so, dear listeners, our gentle journey through the medieval centuries of England draws to its peaceful close. We have walked together through the mists of time, from the Norman ships that crossed the Channel in 1066 to the battlefield at Bosworth, where the last medieval king fell and a new dynasty rose. We have witnessed the building of great castles and soaring cathedrals, the signing of Magna Carta, the devastation of plague, and the courage of